We have 3 presenters, and the intent of these remarks by each of them is to stimulate each other and to stimulate the audience to get involved in a discussion. And the broad topic is, kind of defining and understanding what old growth forests are. The only thought that I have on that topic is that has been, as we heard from Bob Leverett, a kind of long-standing and evolving topic of almost all, well, certainly all of the old growth conferences and some of the kind of ad hoc conferences in between them. We have Charlie Cogbill, Neil Pederson, and Bill Keeton. I'm not going to give their CVs or bio is in the program. Charlie is based here in Vermont and has been studying old growth as long as he's been studying anything. Neil Pederson is one of the absolute leaders in dendroecology and was based for a long time at Lamont Doherty, was at the Harvard Forest and now is independent and footloose and fancy-free researcher who can now speak his mind rather than be constrained by Harvard's dogma. And Bill Keeton, of course, is based here at the University of Vermont as a world expert in forest dynamics, related silvicultural activity, and forest carbon. And we're going to start off with a presentation by Charlie, then followed by Neil, and a rejoinder by Bill, and then discussion with all you. And we're going to constrain everybody to a short time so there's plenty of time for questions and discussion.
Thank you, David, and thank you, organizers. This is a long-standing interest. My first job was as an intern for the Maine Critical Areas Program in 1981, trying to study old growth or an inventory of old growth in Maine. And much of my ideas started at that point in time. The real jump there was, what was old growth? What was the definition? And I've been working on that ever since. In 1994, there was a workshop at Harvard Forest that brought together the contemporary experts. We had several different breakouts of concepts, basis for definition, criteria, age, dynamics, appearance, history, structure, composition. And out of that came absolutely no consensus. There was no emergent report. There was no real common denominator, and that's been the continuation of this process going on. At the time, in 1981, I started collecting what I call the thesaurus of concepts. If you look here, there is broken out into 4 different categories, just to kind of organize it. There's something here for everyone. There's the poets. This is the forest primeval, the murmuring pines and hemlocks. There's something in here for ecologists, climax, a very interesting underpinning of ecology, and actually the old growth concept. There's some overlap, not much. And autogenic, and you don't see self-willed up here. I'd say the ecologist synonym is autogenic. Things are coming, the forest itself is determining the factors of interaction. That is as opposed to anthropogenic or allogenic, whether it's coming from humans or coming from the type of processes that are not inherent in the ecology and the biology, although it is ecology, but the external forces, the environment and where things grow. And those are the 3 universes we're dealing with: an autogenic universe, an anthropogenic universe, and an allogenic universe, and it's a Venn diagram. and their continuities, their transitions among them. Also, the foresters out there, we have overmature, we have late successional, various other types. These are all adjectives. I call this adjectives in search of a noun. In other words, we're trying to find out what it is we're describing it. We're describing it with words. It's a search that gets into 4 different categories: origin, history, development, and structure. I would like to give a revisionist definition that takes into account the myriad geographic, compositional, structural, and putative identification of areas, and investigate the philosophical, theoretical, and very conceptual idea of what is old growth, the concept of old growth. You can get a good deal of it right here, but it really isn't represented there as well as it might be. This revisionist definition is it as a regeneration process that is not directional. It is not part of succession. It's beyond succession. It isn't the end of succession. It isn't teleological. It's something separate from succession, not unrelated. It is not necessarily structural. It's not necessarily either necessary or sufficient to have certain characteristics. It's more encompassing than that. It is not short-lived. It's goes on, maybe eternal, but we had glaciers, so we might cut off a little bit of that. And so those are all negatives. It's not this and not that. What is it? And I think the common concepts here, and you can go down, they're more or less there. A minimal disturbance. That's on a sliding scale, but there's a certain threshold with which disturbance will throw you from autogenic into allogenic. It might be the Cathedral Pines in Connecticut. That was the flagship of the Connecticut Nature Conservancy, and known much earlier on. And it was their idea of what the old growth, always with little rabbit ears around it. And then it got hit by a tornado. And then Tom Sycamore went in, because of the fire danger and whatever, and got a bunch of tree cores on the trees that were cut out to prevent. It was actually a very nice article by Bill Pederson and David Foster about Tabernacle Woods. It's really Cathedral Pines. And what they found was that it was more or less an even-age stand with 2 or 3 holdovers of oak around the edges. And after the tornado that they thought they'd lost, much like the Pishka tract, they thought they lost in 1938 when the Harvard Forest archetypal icon blew down. It actually was more natural in a certain sense after the blowdown than it was before the blowdown. Before it was an old field, and after it was an allogenic forest, and maybe in the future it'd be something beyond that. So that is trying to get a definition, and I've been working a long time on this. My definition that I've come up with is conceptual, it's theoretical, it is a continuous set of processes that last a long time. Yep. And I want to go on to some pragmatic things, which is to propose criteria to quantify those characteristics of continuity, processes, not structure, verbs all, not nouns, and see what we can get as a working definition of old growth. And I propose that it has a documented history of development, mostly through dendrochronology, paleoecology, historical ecology, history, not anecdotal written down that everyone says it's there, but let's get some actual data. A canopy median age of 50%. You've heard that from Bob Leverett. I developed that concept in 1981, and it's finally sinking in. 50% median canopy age of 50% of the maximum species longevity. That is not arbitrary. There's a mathematical basis to regeneration and replacement and a constant disturbance regime that isn't a Weibull function. You don't understand what I'm talking about. It has a mathematical basis. And a continuity of at least 2 tree generations on site. This is very significant. A tree generation is around here for certain species is 150 to 200 years. The average age of humans is about 70 years. So 2 tree generations is 6 human generations, and we're almost into the indigenous concept of let's have something developed for 7 generations. My definition emphasizes processes. These are the processes of old growth, not of succession, that produce and maintain integrity and legacy of what we will determine when we collect the data of old growth. Thank you.
Thanks, Charlie. I really appreciate that because it set me up nicely for this. My objective isn't actually to give you a definition. I'm actually moving beyond definitions. My objective here today is to really have a conversation more about what is old growth in the context of today's state, and especially in the Northeastern Old Growth Forests, and also thinking about building old growth into the future. I'm the only author of this because I didn't want anyone to catch flack for whatever I'm going to say. But I really need to honor the team that I've been working with for the last 4 years when we've been studying old growth forests in 4 different national forests, but also here across the northeastern United States. Dave Orwig and Eric Danielson will give you some data related to this. But walking through these forests, thinking through these forests, sometimes for the second time in 30 years or so, they help me coalesce many thoughts that I've been developing over the last 10, 15, 20 years. And so where I am right now is I really question rubrics. I'm sorry, Charlie. I really question rubrics about defining, identifying old growth forests, and I really question having narrow expectations for old growth forests. The reason for this is because of disturbance. The reason for old growth forests are complex, they're dynamic, but they're complex and they're dynamic because of disturbance. And when we visit, measure, study these old growth forests, we're studying them in a very narrow point in time. And so the foundation of whatever my definition might be is Charlie's in the sense that old growth forests are time and process, ecological process. What I want to add to it is to take for me, and a logical extension of that is it's not a destination. It's not structure. It is process. And so when I'm glad Charlie mentioned succession because this is my successional model of how forests develop over time. They're not linear, they're not straight lines, and I would say they defy our expectations. But importantly here, our time scales, when we think about old growth forests, they're semi-stable, they're stoic. But if we think about old growth forests on the time scales of trees and forests and their development, I want you to think that they're fluid. They're stable when we visit them, they're not stable over time. And time is the key thing. So like Leslie, the speaker earlier this morning, talked about trees as our best teachers and elders. I listen to the trees. And what the trees have told me, and it's a little washed out, but anyways, time is unique, and there's scientific proof for this. Tree ring scientists like myself have shown that we could put calendar dates correctly with no errors back to 774, and we can probably do it longer than that, but that's what we've provided evidence for. And so there's this idea that history repeats itself, and someone refined that and they said, well, history doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes. But I'm going to tell you, in the tree ring world, climate, tree growth, and the external swirling of our environment, there is no repeating over time, over blocks of time, because if it did repeat itself, we wouldn't be able to cross-date so precisely. So time is unique. And it hardly even rhymes. We can find cycles, but they might be meaningless. And so I've been starting to think about this in a spatial way. So this is looking over my left shoulder in Kentucky, and it's a beautiful, young, almost even-aged, it looked even-aged, tulip poplar forest. You look over my right shoulder, and there's the old-growth forest that's well known at Lily Cornet Woods. So you put that together, the uniqueness of time, storms, frost events, people management, stewardship, all that, mixing in with a variety of species, genetics diversity within that species, where the tree is growing, the complexity of our landscapes, and you put that all together, old-growth forests are widely variable over time and space. And this challenges rubrics and expectations. And this idea came about as a part of the Black Swan Project, the one that Dave and Eric are going to talk about at this site. Stephen Jackson, I asked him, I said, can you show me an old-growth northern hardwood forest that we can study in the Adirondacks? He sent us the whole pond. There's Dave right there. We walked up in there to where Stephen said it was, and after 20 or 30 minutes, it dawned on us that this, what looked like a second growth forest to us, it didn't look like Cathedral Pines, Pennsylvania, it didn't look like the Congaree, it didn't look like the Sierra Club pictures of old growth forests, that if we could stand up the beach, it would look like an old growth forest, but the beach are gone. So is this worthy of old growth forest protection? Because it's been wiped out by, or heavily damaged, not wiped out, heavily damaged by an exotic pest and pathogen? What do we do with these forests? They're still, personally, I find them very valuable. And this brings us into the idea of global change, eastern old growth forests, because this is happening everywhere. It just doesn't have 60-foot flames on our TV screens. So what do you think about old growth Paulownia? The old growth Paulownia is the Paulownia in the Cherokee National Forest are embedded in old growth forests. They're only 13 or 20 years old, but they're finding habitat to live. Is that still an old growth forest? The chestnut oaks are 200 and 300 years old, and other species are as well. I want to keep it in the old growth category, but I know it would violate some other people's definitions. And so the way I think about it now, I think old growth forest definitions, the quibbling of them, the many, many decades of quibbling over old growth definitions is highly valuable for science. This is how we learn about ecosystems. We're quibbling because we're trying to learn and trying to understand these systems, these beings that live much longer than our observations. But we're at an important point in time. 30 years ago, Bill McKibben talked about the explosion of green, the reforestation of the eastern U.S. forest. And I think in that article, or maybe in my mind, I don't remember which it was, I thought about what are we going to do with these forests when they become 150 years old? They've been cut once. Do we cut them again because they've been cut once? That has been an important question in my mind for a long time. And so in that context, as a part of the work we did in the Cherokee National Forest, we studied mature and old-growth forests across a lot of the Cherokee. And using traditional measures of age and structure, there is no statistical difference between second growth and old growth. The second growth in the Cherokee is catching up, quote unquote. Now, I can tell you what the differences are. They're not traditional measures, and a little of them are maybe traditional characteristics or not. But we can see it, but it's not easily quantifiable. And I find this as a positive message. The second growth forests are catching up. And so what's the value, in my mind, of old growth definitions for conservation? My thoughts on this are evolving and they're becoming less important, and I'm moving into the category of Dr. Barbara Martin, who 30 or so years ago told us, he said, you know, if they took out 1 or 2, 3 spruce trees per acre in a northern hardwood forest 110 years ago, maybe that's old growth. And at that time, I remember I was a little shocked because maybe I was a little more strict then. I'm firmly in that category now, and global change is changing that even more. I would suggest for conservation, we just describe the forest as it is, as we know it, as best we can. And even if that forest has been cut, I think that when we do that, when we talk about the real history of that forest, we're speaking to the resilience of trees and forests, and I think that's exciting for people. I think that speaks to resilience. And if we do that and we conserve those forests that have been cut, we are empowering people not to just simply conserve a legacy. We are helping them, we're empowering them to create a legacy of future old growth forests. And I just want to do a quick, I had to cut so many slides, but I wanted to honor the people that 50, 60 years ago were finding that old growth forests didn't look like the Sierra Club calendar. Thank you.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you, David, for the introduction. And I'll just start by saying, boy, are we on the same wavelength. I just could not agree more with what both of the previous speakers said. I'm just going to end with a few thoughts of my own, just 5 or 6 minutes, and just 4 points that I'm hoping to cover in my brief remarks. My name is Bill Keeton. Yes, thank you. So first of all, I couldn't agree more with Charlie that we need to focus on process and dynamics, and I want to make a pitch for a functional approach for defining and mapping old growth forests. So let's focus on function. Then I'd like to just tell you a little bit about the alternate methodologies for defining and mapping old growth forests that emerged during the recent national inventory of mature and old growth forests. I want to touch on this concept or this tension in the science and in the movement between continuity versus redevelopment of old growth characteristics, much as Neil was describing towards the end of his talk. And then I'll end with maybe a final pitch towards a broad, flexible, all-encompassing approach to old growth forests. Okay, let's see how much of this I can actually get through. So first of all, at the end of the day, what I care about is how forests function. How do they regulate the climate? How do they provide habitats for biodiversity? How do they regulate hydrology and control flooding? And this frames my whole approach to old growth, thinking about the different functions that old forests can provide, even though their structural characteristics and their histories and their disturbance regimes may vary considerably. So I would make the argument that we should care more about structure rather than very rigid, prescribed structural definitions or structural criteria. There's no reason why we can't have some of both, but there's a lot more thinking that we need to do about function. And this is because forests, as both of the previous speakers mentioned, old forests, late successional forest systems, are highly dynamic. Old forests come in many different shapes and sizes, and they can develop along multiple pathways. And so we don't want to bind ourselves into this trap of overly prescribed, rigid structural definitions, a menu of indicators that we're always looking for. Again, old forests come in all shapes and sizes. And it was interesting to see this concept emerge a little bit during the recent national inventory. So I'm on to point number 2 now. I'm referring to the national inventory of mature and old growth forests that was conducted during the Biden administration, which led to the development of a draft National Forest Plan amendment that called for the conservation of all remaining old growth forests on national forest lands. Sadly, the amendment did not go into effect before the change of administrations. But in this national inventory, we saw the official inventory methodology proposed by Chris Woodall and colleagues that was, I would say, more traditional in its focus. It was a structure-based methodology based on forest inventory and analysis data, U.S. Forest Service FIA data, a multivariate analysis of those data that resulted in a handful of structural criteria that were used to identify and map mature and old-growth forests. Interesting, but alternate methodologies were also proposed during that process. And I was very intrigued by the methodology proposed by Kevin Barnett and Greg Applett and others at the Wilderness Society that took this functional approach that I'm advocating. They simply asked the question, could we identify and map old-growth forests based on their carbon storage? And they also used FIA data, and they looked at carbon accumulation curves for each forest type across the country, and they identified the 95% threshold where each of those forests approached their maximum carbon carrying capacity, and they used that threshold to identify the onset of old forest characteristics. Again, emphasizing function, in this case, carbon and climate, rather than a strict focus on structure alone. Now, coming out of the national inventory exercise, we can think about using both approaches. There's no reason why we can't use a combination of structure and function, but it's interesting seeing the science certainly moving towards this more functional approach. On to the third point. I would like to comment a little bit on this question of continuity. This has come out recently in a number of publications, even a chapter on old growth definitions in a book that I recently co-edited with Andrew Barton on Eastern Old Growth Forests. The idea that maybe what we should be looking for is continuity. Now, this is what I studied for my PhD research at the University of Washington with Jerry Franklin. I studied how biological legacies influence the rate at which old forests recover from wildfire. So I couldn't agree more. The continuity is important, and it's interesting, and it can influence forest development. But I'm also a big believer, like Neil, in the idea that secondary forests can also redevelop old forest characteristics, and we're already seeing that play out across the landscape. So again, there's no need to bind ourselves into an overly rigid definition. We don't have to be purists. Rather, we need a broader definition of old forests that recognizes the importance of continuity as one possibility, but also the potential to redevelop old forest structure and function in secondary forests. So finally, what is this broader definition that I'm talking about? Well, we could say, all right, we're going to have two classes of old forests. We're going to have forests that have continuity, and that sounds a lot like primary forest or virgin or primeval or some of these other terms. Or we could say the other class would be secondary forests that are recovering these old forest potential. But then we start getting into this kind of mess of vegetation classification that I would say has mired the Europeans for decades. The Europeans have gone whole hog with this classification, systematics, typology type approach. And over there, they've developed a very complex system for defining natural forests based on a natural forest index. They have something like 20 or more classes of natural forests. And I think when you get into that degree of complexity, you're actually inhibiting conservation more than you're helping it. What do we do with 20 different classes of old forests? So while I see a value in distinguishing between continuity and secondary redevelopment, I don't want us to become overly mired in this type of classification approach. So final comment, I know I'm out of time, is that we need a broad, flexible definition that encompasses the range of variability in developmental pathways and structural conditions, as well as the range of variability in functions that old forests are providing. So broad, flexible, and encompassing. I hope that made some sense. Thank you very much.
Okay, that was terrific and really set things up nicely. While these guys are going to come up here to answer questions, what kind of comments and questions are there? Yeah. And let's see, do we have somebody with a mic? We've gotten the third row there, fourth row in the back. Sorry, hang on, Daniel. Well, here you're close enough. We can give you this one.
Okay.
I wish I could frame this a little bit better, but we've spent a lot of time talking about wildlands the past couple of days, and incredibly important tool for supporting old forests. And yet wildlands and old forests are not the same. And so what should we keep in mind thinking about these definitions to help us think about the strategies we use to promote old forest and while achieving the functional goals of old forests across the landscape? Yes. Hi, all. I'm Keith Thompson.
Would you please just be in the light when you're answering your question?
Here, let me go in reverse order. Bill.
That's a great question, Keith. My pitch was for an approach that would think about forests very broadly in terms of functions that they provide. So that's much like the idea of high conservation value forests. So high conservation value forests, of course, include old growth, but they include many other things. So I might answer you by saying, as we're thinking about what are important to include within wildlands, is this the gist of your question, that we should be thinking very broadly about old forests as they occur in many different conditions, as well as very broadly around all of the forests that are providing critical functions that we care about, like habitat, like carbon, like hydrology. So in like 10 seconds, that's the best I can do responding.
Yes, I'm just thinking, it isn't that old growths are any better or any worse than all the other forest types. A lot of that is human values. And other forests of whatever you want to call them, second growth, primary growth, just blew down last year, serve ecological functions. Some of them the same that have been enumerated for older forests. And I really want to get into the idea of what is unique about old growth that doesn't occur in these other forests, or doesn't develop through time, short time, but develops through long time, evolutionary time. And that's my idea of this 2 generations, and I wish it were 3 or 7 generations. That there are certain characters or functions that are being served by this. Continuity does not mean steady state, particularly. It just means predictability within a range of some time in the future. And that range is fairly large. It just can't go over the tipping point. So all forests have values, all forests have functions. Old growth might have unique functions, and as my major professor, who was a student of John Curtis, used to say, this is a unique geographic location. Yes, no matter what it was, whether it had a rare plant in it, whether it had an old growth forest in it, it is unique, and it comes in all colors, all sizes, all values.
I don't really have a good conclusion for your question, but what you made me think about is there was a forest manager down in the longleaf pine system in North Florida, Leon Neal. He's passed away now. He managed a forest. It was primarily wealthy landowners for quail hunting, but he walked us into this one forest. It's called Big Woods. It's in the Greenwood Plantation, and he said that there was more wood on the landscape in the 90s than when he started managing it in the 50s, and he had taken a lot of wood off the landscape. The important thing to add to that was the red cockaded woodpecker and many Bachman sparrow, many threatened endangered species, they were all there in a managed, quote unquote, I would actually stewarded landscape. And so when I asked a buddy about like, why can't we do that? And he goes, too many entries, which really means it costs too much. So we have to decide what we value, honestly. That's how I view it. Do we, Leon, with good subsidies from landowners, but, National Forest Service can be that way too. He balanced the ecology with the economics. It's possible, I've seen it done, it's just whether we want to do it or not. That's what you make me think about. I've seen a forest that most people would think would look like an old growth forest, but it was quite managed, stewarded.
My name is Daniel Carpin. I've lived on Long Island for over 70 years. Some comments about old growth. So when I was a child, I was told the old growth on Long Island was cut. That's not true. I have a poster session about my 700-year-old black tupelo trees that I found on Long Island. Estimated ages because they're hollow and can't be cored, so you get the approximate age by the bark characteristics will change over time. Second of all, a lot of these forests have the understory, which can be very old. You'll see a picture on my poster of a high bush blueberry, which I've seen for the last 60 years. It's leaning over. I can't core it because it's too fragile, but I believe it's actually several hundred years old. So we really got to look more at the understory, what's happening. When I visited the Southern Appalachians, I have seen mountain laurel, 15 inches in diameter. I believe that some of these understory mountain laurel may be hundreds of years old. I have a small core, a cookie from a 2-inch diameter mountain laurel on Long Island. It's like 70 years old or something, and they can grow to great age. I'd also like to make a comment about the term old growth forest. We really should say old growth ecosystem. On Long Island, we have salt marshes. People have carbon dated the peat in there, and they're like 4,000 years old or more. So we really need the term really should be old growth ecosystem. Next to the salt marsh, in some areas, you might have a sand dune, and on top of the sand dune, I have found like beach plums. Well, beach plum trees get to maybe 7 inches high, but they're like 6 or 8 inches in diameter. Is this an old growth tree or is it old growth forest? I've affirmed the term old growth ecosystem. So you can comment on what I had to say.
Okay.
A substitute of landscape for ecosystems. Landscapes is a larger scale beyond the stands that we usually see as, and we're looking for landscapes.
Say that again.
Okay, I would substitute landscape in there if you want functions, ecosystems. That just a lot of what our data and our vision is of stands, very small areas that are pieces, I call them baubles. That's a kind of a jewel that isn't quite.
Well, I would say that if there's one defining characteristic of an old forest landscape, it is the spatial complexity. It is the idea that because of disturbance, because of dynamics, the landscape over time breaks up into an incredible complexity of patches, each with different structure, different composition, et cetera. So I've often said that perhaps it's that spatial complexity that is the most important thing to look for. That might come back to Keith's question earlier, like what is an old forest landscape that we want to manage for? So your idea of patch complexity at the landscape scale, I think is dead on.
There's back there, Tom.
Tom Spies. I'm wondering who should develop definitions of old growth, and how should they? Do we need a consensus? And maybe a third part is, we've heard great dimensions of the ecological ecosystem aspects of it, but a lot, I think, of what's going on is a social, less easily quantified. In fact, I would argue that the science is secondary to the emotional and the spiritual aspects.
Yeah, just to repeat what Mac Hunter, University of Maine, said, we could define it out of existence, or we could spread it to what it really has to cover.
Yeah, I don't have really much to say about that. Part of my motivation for this abstract was I've been coming to Eastern Old Growth meetings for 30 years, and I've seen so many talks on definitions. I'm kind of over the definitions. I'm just over it. So the value, the human value is really important. I think it's important to document, the ancient systems and the complex systems, and to understand that the young forests are just can often be a continuation of that, and I value that a lot. That's me personally, but the definitions is, I'm beyond definitions a little bit.
It's all semantics.
Yeah.
First of all, Tom, I'll say that you haven't aged a day in like 30 years. I don't know how this is possible. I agree with my colleagues. Something about that Oregon water. I think I am so through with definitions also. I'm just absolutely sick of them. I think it's time for the science and the practice to move forward and to move beyond that, and just talk about forests that we care about and forests that have value. And that might include places that people are particularly attached to for whatever reason. It might also include forests that are providing certain functions that are really important. Tomorrow I'm going to talk about riparian forests and old growth riparian corridors and how important those are. So let's focus on functions and forests that people care about.
Yeah, and I think as the microphone is going back, I think that your question and your point about social values is a great part of the answer to Keith's question. I mean, there are distinctions between wildlands and old-growth forests. Wildlands can include old-growth forests, but wildlands and their management is all about future ecological conditions, but it's very much about current social values and landowner values and attitudes towards management of particular landscapes. So,
yeah, thanks. To me, it seems like the definition depends on what the question is you're asking. And if you're trying to identify what forest should we protect, I think the structural side is, it flags sort of where it is on its journey, and this deserves special attention. But if you're trying to sort of advance science to say, well, what's the potential of old growth forests? I'm a little bit on the functional side. There's a graph by Dr. Spies and Franklin that shows biodiversity very high of a young forest. It goes into a trough for about 200 years and then eventually comes up. And there's a lot of scientific research out there that often looks at biodiversity, avian, other forms, and they're looking at how does a young forest due to a mature forest. But in reality, even an old growth forest can still be down in that trough. And I think that, just spurring on science to say, let's keep tracking this thing, and whether it's coarse woody debris driving it or whatever, what drives biodiversity. So again, structural is, I think, way too insufficient in that question. But in terms of what do you protect? And maybe there are other questions, whether it's philosophical, culture, or whatever, but it seems like there's not, you might be tempted to say there's a million questions out there. There may be, a half a dozen, and you say, depending on what you're trying to do, this is the definition that we recommend.
thanks. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Oh, I'm sorry, Jim Gresh from Ohio.
Thanks.
May I add one methodology? I've spent the past part of my career looking at historical ecology and not finding out what will be, but finding out what was. I use land survey techniques and witness trees and things like that. And I've been involved in the Paleon project, which is an NSF macro systems, when it did exist, a project that has reconstructed the upper Midwest over the past 2,000 years. And the parameterization starts with that witness tree pre-Euro-American settlement. And we have a very good idea, which I think is the ideal baseline to which to compare both present and potential. One of the objectives of the Paleon projects was to invert the hindcasting and forecast. It never succeeded, but at least we have a 200-year head start on understanding ecosystem, landscape, forest development.
Great point, great question. Comment. Did you have a question, Bob? There's time for one more.
Thanks, Bob Zano. I guess I feel a little unmoored because I agree about you get lost in definitions and it becomes unhelpful, but at the end of the day, we need to decide what it should be a conservation focus and how to judge whether restoration of something is actually going in a direction we want. And I guess I was wondering if you could provide some perspective on how we assess future conservation.
Yeah, I started out being interested in restoration ecology quite some time ago. And the argument then becomes restore to what, at what time period, and we don't know. Part of my ecological model there is we have the path that the ecosystem came to the present day over the last 5, 7, 10,000 years, but we don't see the possible branches it could have gone into, and we don't have all the details of why it changed. And now the climate has changed. Now there's a lot of pests and pathogens, and I spent a lot of time in Kentucky, and they're spending a lot of money trying to restore the inner bluegrass region of Kentucky. Though there's not been enough work done yet, but there's one study of old trees on the edge of the Kentucky inner bluegrass. The trees were suppressed until the colonists arrived. There is not as much, so it challenges the idea of how much of this was the inner bluegrass region. And so what I'm trying to say is I think ecosystems change so much far beyond that what we understand and know right now, and with what's going to happen, what's happening now and what's happening in the future. Restoration in my mind is, I loved it, I love the idea of it, but I'm just not so sure about where we should spend our money. In my mind, we should conserve as much landscape as possible and shape it gently and carefully and lightly as we see fit. That's just my thing. I'm really in the, yeah. I would love to push things to longer rotation times, for example.
And just to quickly add, I think most of our iconic places, whether you call them old growth or whatever the definition may be, are small. They're all oddballs. They're that way because something has happened in the matrix that they're buried in that didn't happen there for good reason. So restoration should be restoration of the common land, the lost land, rather than trying to preserve or catch it 50 years into its potential future. Literally, I think conservation should be not exclusively, but let's get back to an idea of a representative set of places rather than
Do we have time, Liz? Yeah. Okay. I appreciate that question so much.
on the topic of restoration, I am a believer in restoration. I just believe that it needs to be adaptive, just like all forest management. I also believe that we can think about restoring old forest conditions that are dynamic, both passively through wildland areas, as well as actively through restoration forestry practices. I've always believed that those are complementary approaches, not mutually exclusive. So we can do some of both, wildlands as well as active restoration. Coming back to your core question though, like what do we conserve, right? What do we use? And I mean, I would say it might be as simple as starting with the forests that are truly primary forests that have never been cleared before, or maybe have only been partially cleared. So you protect those for sure. And then you think about the rest of the landscape and where you have the greatest potential to redevelop old forest conditions and dynamics in secondary forests. And then you try to build a functional landscape. So that's the best I could say in short, and I think we're out of time.
Thanks very much to everybody who contributed, everybody who came.